and I just hit go live. So hopefully it'll show up over on Rumble momentarily. Again, if the first couple of minutes it doesn't show up, please let me know, because we'll have to figure out a different way to do it. All right, thank you. So we're on chapter 1. We did the prologue yesterday, if you guys were not here. And chapter 1 in this book starts off the Devil's Chessboard. It's labeled The Double Agent. And it starts off discussing Allen Dulles going to war in November of 1942. He had spent some time in Vichy, France, which was known at the time for being the quote unquote resistance area. And he went over into Switzerland, which of course we know is supposedly neutral, but was basically being the vassal state of Hitler's movement of money through various mechanisms, particularly the Bank of International Settlement. And it's not coincidental that Allen Dulles was chosen to go to Switzerland, being a banker at Sullivan and Cromwell on behalf of all of the American interest. So they describe him as a 49-year-old Wall Street lawyer with a very high profile. After presenting his passport to the French border guards, he passed for his proceeding into Geneva. He paced the train platform while the policeman made a call to the Vichy authorities. Then, after hovering Gestapo agents conveniently disappeared, almost like by design, Dulles was through. There was nothing undercover about Allen Dulles's wartime exploits in Switzerland. There was little daring involved for a very simple reason. Dulles was more in step with many of the Nazi leaders than he was President Roosevelt. Dulles not only enjoyed a professional and social familiarity with many of the members of the Third Reich elite that predated the war, he shared many of the men's post-war goals. While serving in his Swiss outpost, Dulles might have been enriched by Nazi forces, but he was also surrounded by old friends. After crossing the border and settling in to Bern, B-E-R-N, the scenic Swiss capital, where he had begun his espionage career a quarter century earlier as a junior member of the U.S. legation during World War I. It's a medieval city built on cliffs overlooking a river. During the earlier war, there had been embassy parties and rounds of tennis, with the tennis balls arriving in diplomatic pouches from the home countries. His was being sent to him by his brother, John Foster. There was also international parade of mistresses, young secretaries from the consulates that filled the city's diplomatic quarters, as well as free-spirited women from local art colonies. He met his conquest for drinks and pleasure at the Bellevue Palace Hotel. It was an elegant Art Nouveau fortress that dominated the old city's skyline. One of his affairs during the First World War had a brutal ending. She was a young Czech patriot who worked alongside Dulles in the U.S. legation office. British agents concluded that she was using her position to pass information to exiled Czech leader as well as to Germans. When the British about their suspicions, Dulles was in an awkward spot. He quickly complied with their plans. One night, Dulles took the woman to dinner, and afterwards he strolled along the streets to an agreed upon location where he handed her over to two British agents. She disappeared forever. When Dulles returned to Bern in 1942 for the OSS, he set up his base of operations in his residence, the ground floor apartment of a handsomely renovated 14th century mansion near the center's majestic cathedral. Dulles later insisted that he had carefully chosen the location for security, since the street ended in a cul-de-sac. He prevailed upon the municipal authorities to extinguish the lamplight outside of his building, giving anonymity to his visitors. Guests seeking more confidentiality could enter the rear of his apartment. But all the cloak and dagger was a bit of a charade. As soon as Dulles showed up in Bern, his arrival was reported in the leading newspapers, which announced him to the spies' great delight as the personal representative of President Roosevelt. This afforded him a status that would be very useful. Dulles found himself under intense scrutiny. From across the street, Nazi agents kept very close watch on Dulles's residence 24 hours a day. The Germans also infiltrated his staff. His cook turned out to be a spy, and his janitor stole carbon copies of his documents from his trash. Swiss intelligence agents who worked closely with their Nazi counterparts eavesdropped on Dulles's phone conversations. There was little that was secret about the Americans' spy life. He didn't even have a bodyguard, and he didn't carry a gun. This strategy of hiding in plain sight did not make much sense from an espionage point of view. But that's not really why he was there. He was running foreign policy on behalf of a loose association with FDR. While Bill Donovan, the director of the OSS, originally wanted to station Dulles in London, but Dulles insisted it had to be Bern, and he prevailed, of course. Donovan, who himself was a World War I combat hero and self-made Wall Street millionaire lawyer who had charmed FDR and outmaneuvered powerful rival J. Edgar Hoover to build the country's first international intelligence agency. Undaunted by Washington's bureaucracy, Donovan had recruited an eclectic array of talent, from Ivy League adventurers to society girls to safecrackers and professional killers. But Dulles, who moved in the same social circles as Donovan and competed aggressively with him on the tennis court, was not at all in awe of his boss. He thought he could do a better job than Donovan of running the show. Dulles also positioned himself in Bern because the Swiss capital was the center of wartime financial and political intrigue. Bern was an espionage bazaar, teeming with spies, double agents, informers, peddlers of secrets. Switzerland was a financial haven for the Nazi war machine. The Swiss demonstrated that they were the masters of duplicity during the war. Banks in Zurich and Basel allowed the Nazis to stash their treasure while they were looting Europe. They put them in secret accounts, which Germany then used to buy the essential products from neutral countries funneled into the Third Reich, like tungsten from Spain, oil from Romania, steel from Sweden, and beef from Argentina. It gave them basically plausible deniability. Like, we're not really funding the Nazis, but we are. We're selling all this stuff to Switzerland, which far exceeded anything that Switzerland would need because they weren't at war. All the while, they reaped huge profits from behind-the-scenes deals with the Nazis' Reichsbank. Dulles knew many of the central players in the secret Swiss financial arena because he and his brothers had worked with them as clients and business partners at Sullivan and Cromwell. The Dulles Brothers Wall Street law firm was at the center of the international network of banks, investment firms, and industrial conglomerates that rebuilt Germany after World War I, and they all got rich. The law firm's top executive grew skilled at structuring the complex merry-go-round of transactions that funneled massive U.S. investments into the German industrial giants like IG Farben, chemical conglomerate, and Krupp Steel. The profits generated from these investments then flowed to France and Britain in the form of war reparations so they could pay off their loans to the United States. That's old money laundering for you. And they all got rich off of it. John Foster became so deeply enmeshed in the lucrative revitalization of Germany that he found it difficult to separate his firm's interests from the rising economic and military power, even after Hitler had consolidated control over the country. Foster continued to represent the German cartels like IG Farben as they were integrated into the Nazi war machine, helping the industrial giant secure access to key war materials during the war. He donated money to America First, the campaign to keep the United States out of the gathering war in Europe. We went over America First in one of our very first shows on the Alpha Warrior Show. He also helped sponsor a rally honoring Charles Lindbergh, the aviation hero who had become enchanted by Hitler's miraculous revival of Germany. John Foster refused to shut down the Berlin office of Sullivan and Cromwell, whose attorneys were forced to sign their correspondence Heil Hitler, until his partners, including Allen Dulles, fearful of the PR disaster, insisted he do so. When John Foster finally gave in at an extremely tense 1935 partners meeting at their Wall Street office, he cried. Foster still could not bring himself to cut off his former Berlin law partner, Gerhard Westrick, when he showed up in New York in August of 1940 to lobby on behalf of Hitler. Setting himself up in an opulent estate, Westrick invited influential New York society types for weekend parties, talking about opportunities in his pro-Hitler charm offensive. Westrick's guest list were dominated by oil executives because he particularly was keen on a secured flow of fuel into Germany because there was an embargo by the British Navy. He even had the gall to throw a gala party at the Waldorf Astoria in June of 1940 to celebrate Nazis' defeat of France. Westrick's shameless audacity created an uproar in the New York press, but John Foster rushed to the Nazi promoter's defense, insisting that he had a high regard for the guy's integrity. Until late in the day, John Foster harbored sympathy for the devil himself, Adolf Hitler. Even after the Nazi regime had pushed into existence the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws of 1935 and unleashed waves of terror against Germany's Jewish population, John Foster clung to a sympathetic view of Hitler. He could not help but being impressed by a man who had humble beginnings, has attained the unquestionable leadership of a great nation, Foster wrote to a friend in 1937. And by 1939, Eustace Singleman, a junior Jewish partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, had become so fed up with John Foster's position on Nazi Germany that he confronted his boss, telling Foster that he was hurting the firm's reputation by publicly suggesting that Germany's position is more morally superior to that of the Allies. Dulles met face to face with Hitler in their Berlin office in March of 1933. He was ostensibly there on a fact-finding mission for FDR. But Dulles was particularly interested in determining what Hitler's rise meant for the law firm's corporate clients in Germany and the US. And this is better understood if you've read Anthony Sutton's book about how these guys actually financed the rise of Hitler. It makes perfect sense. As Dulles subsequently informed John Foster, he did not find Hitler particularly alarming, and he was rather impressed with Joseph Goebbels, remarking on the Nazi propaganda chief's sincerity and frankness as he produced propaganda campaigns. That's definitely Orwellian. After Dulles and fellow U.S. statesman Norman Davis returned to their luxury hotel, Davis was unnerved to say the word, to find the word Juden scrolled crudely on the door of his room, even though he was not Jewish. The conditions are not quite as bad. That was a quote about Hitler, but Dulles nonetheless wrote Foster from Germany that basically he was saying that the conditions were not all that bad there. Not for you. By the end of the 1930s, Dulles's view finally shifted, and he came around to dismiss Nazi leaders as mad people in control of Germany. He grew increasingly certain that the U.S. must prepare for a showdown with Hitler, which basically is what they were planning for all along. But out of deference to John Foster, Allen Dulles was reluctant to make his opinions public. He also continued to do business with Nazi financial and industrial networks, joining the board of J. Henry Schroeder Bank, the U.S. subsidiary of a London bank that Time magazine in 1939 called the economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis. Allen and his wife Clover continued to socialize with the Lindberghs, who were their neighbors on Long Island. Lindbergh was enamored with Hitler. He noted that in his diary. And he also noted that he and Dulles have sometimes similar views on a number of instances. Even after Allen Dulles was recruited into the OSS by Donovan in October of 1941, his loyalties were still questioned by some administration officials, including Roosevelt. Dulles's various financial connections to the Nazi regime prompted FDR to place the Wall Street lawyer under close surveillance when he began working at the OSS suite at Rockefeller Center. Monitoring Dulles proved an easy task since he shared office space with a massive British spy operation under the control of William Stevenson, who would become famous as the man called Intrepid. At one point, Stevenson's Rockefeller Center operation, which was tucked away under the name of British Security Coordination, grew to be as many as 3,000 employees. It was remarkably ambitious, covert enterprise, particularly considering that England was operating on friendly soil. They were actually operating together. Stevenson had been sent to the U.S. in 1940 on behalf of Winston Churchill. With Hitler's forces overrunning Europe and turning their gaze towards England, Churchill knew that his nation's only hope was to convince the U.S. to get in the war. Roosevelt was a strong supporter of the British cause, with as much as 80% of the American public against entering the European war. They were going to need a propaganda campaign and obviously something to kick it off. The British government and the Roosevelt White House faced not only a deeply wary American public with concerns about the cost of the war, but a well-financed appeasement lobby with strong links to Nazi Germany. Churchill made it clear that he was quite willing to engage in ungentlemanly warfare to save his nation and do whatever it took to get the US in the game. Stevenson was the British point man in his underground war against Nazi Germany on American soil. Stevenson was also willing to do dirty tricks of espionage. He was a smooth, self-assured, and self-made millionaire. He proved adept at the black art of espionage. He worked his press contacts in America to expose Nazi front companies, including some of Dulles Brothers' corporate clients, and pressuring Washington to deport Nazi lobbyists. Stevenson's operatives also undertook black bag operations, such as breaking into the Spanish embassy in Washington, where they stole the secret codes for diplomatic messages flowing between General Franco fascist government in Berlin. Stevenson was even authorized to kill people in the Nazi network inside of the United States. One of the men considered for elimination was none other than Dulles' business partner, Gerhard Westrick. The big spending Hitler lobbyist was eventually deported. It is this ungentlemanly Stevenson's tactic that inspired Fleming to grant his hero the license to kill. Fleming was a great admirer of Stevenson, whom he called a magnetic personality and one of the great secret agents of World War II. The novelist who worked with Stevenson's operation as a British naval intelligence agent in Washington also praised the spy master's martinis. But as Fleming himself observed, even his fictional hero, James Bond, was not in fact a hero, but an efficient and not very attractive blunt instrument in the hands of government. Years later, when James Jesus Angleton and William Harvey, two legends of the counterintelligence, were searching for assassins to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro, they sought the advice of Peter Wright, another British affiliate. Have you thought of approaching Stevenson? Wright suggested. A lot of the old timers say he ran that kind of thing in New York during the war. FDR was well aware of the Dulleses and their Wall Street gang, as well as the Republican Party opposition to his presidency. The brothers, as top legal advisors to American business royalty, were the very symbols of the elite that the president riled against. Now, I understand this author's position on this, but anybody that thinks the Delano and the Roosevelt family wasn't part of that elite is drinking Kool-Aid. I'm just going to say that. One of the firebrands was William O. Douglas, the progressive young lawyer of President Roosevelt, put in charge of Securities and Exchange Commissions, the newly formed Wall Street watchdog agency, and later appointed a justice on the Supreme Court. As FDR's top Wall Street regulator, Douglas had more than one occasion to work with John Foster Dulles. Years later, Dulles's hatred for the self-righteous senior Dulles brother still reverberated in his memoir. John Foster carried himself like a high churchman, observed Douglas, but in reality, he was a predatory Wall Street shill who, for a fee, would stand for almost anything, according to Douglas. If the John Foster Dulleses of America were destined for heaven, a man of his ilk would almost certainly end up in hell. Or Douglas said he'd prefer hell if the Dulleses were going to heaven. All right. Douglas had worked his way through Columbia Law School. One of the talented law school graduates' first job interviews had been with John Foster Dulles at Sullivan and Cromwell. But he says of John Foster Dulles that he was so pontifical that Douglas decided against joining the firm. In fact, he says, I was so struck by his bombastic personality that when he helped me with my coat as I was leaving, I turned and gave him a quarter tip. There are some people who say that he wasn't hired, but whatever. He didn't like John Foster Dulles. That's the bottom line. After joining the FDR administration at 35, Douglas quickly developed a reputation as a rising New Deal star, taking over as chairman of the SEC from Joseph Kennedy in 1937 and becoming a fixture in the president's inner circle, frequently a guest at Camp David. While serving at the SEC, Douglas had become a pariah of the financial industry. Bankers and lawyers accustomed to suites and private dining rooms were yanked before public hearings presided over by Dulles and his sharp staff and forced to account for their business practices. Even Robert Swain of the white shoe law firm Cravath, who had once been Douglas's boss, got the full treatment. You stood on my head and shook out all of my fillings up in my teeth, he remarked. Dulles once put Foster on the witness stand for 2 full days, grilling him about the fortune that he had reaped for his law firm by managing the bankruptcy procedures that had fleeced a multiple of creditors. By sicking men like William Douglas on men like John Foster Dulles, FDR drove the elite mad. J.P. Morgan Jr. was so incensed by the class traitor FDR that his servants had to cut out the president's picture from a Wall Street Titan's morning newspaper over fear he would spike his blood pressure. FDR even resulted in at least 2 abortive coups. So they say that there was at least 2 abortive coups during Roosevelt's presidency. And of course, we know about the one of Smedley Butler, but there was also one that involved DuPont and Cornelius Vanderbilt. The DuPont, sorry. In 1940, newspaperman and socialite Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., one of FDR's friends in New York, tipped off Eleanor Roosevelt to another anti-Roosevelt plot that he had heard about, and that was the one that involved Smedley Butler. FDR apparently had his own reasons for allowing Dulles to establish himself in Bern. John Loftus, an author, later said that he was a dangle, a former, the White House wanted Dulles in clear contact with his Nazi clients so they could be easily identified. One of Dulles's most important contacts in Europe was Thomas McKittrick, an old Wall Street friend who was the president of the Bank of International Settlements. And that's where, just for those of you who've not followed me for a long time, what Hitler did was when he conquered a new country, whether it was France or Romania or whatever, he took all of their gold that they had on account at the Bank of International Settlement and did a ledger. McKittrick did a ledger entry and put it under Germany's name. So the way that worked is, in order to join the Bank of International Settlements and have them, facilitate the flow of money, you had to put a certain amount of gold on deposit there. And so every time Hitler conquered a new country, they just did a ledger entry and moved all of their gold on the balance sheet as if the country disappeared into the German account. The Bank of International Settlement had been created as basically a central bank of the central banks. It was set up in the aftermath of World War I as the first step to the World Bank and the IMF set up after World War II. It was a long-term plan. The Bank of International Settlement was so secretive that no one was permitted to peer inside its boardroom, even when it was empty. By 1940, when McKittrick arrived in Switzerland to oversee the bank, it was effectively controlled by the Hitler's regime. 5 of its directors would later be charged in war crimes, including Hermann Schmidt, the CEO of IG Farben. Schmidt was one of the many Dulles brothers' law clients and business associates who was involved with the Bank of International Settlements. The secretive bank became a crucial financial partner for Nazi Emil Pohl, the vice president of Hitler's Reichsbank and a close associate of McKittrick. Pohl once called the Bank of International Settlement the Reichsbank's foreign branch, meaning it was basically working for Hitler. They laundered hundreds of millions of dollars in Nazi gold looted from the treasuries of occupied countries. Dulles connected with McKittrick as soon as he set foot in Europe, meeting with the Bank of International Settlement president in Lisbon, even before he had reached Switzerland. Both men were eager to talk. The banker recalled, quote, "Somebody grabbed me from behind and said, 'Is that you, Tom McKittrick? Well, my gosh, I've got to see you. You're the first man I wanted to see in Switzerland,' unquote." Of course, that was Alan Dulles. The 2 men stayed up all night at the hotel in conversation until McKittrick had to leave for his plane the following day. Dulles was eager to pump McKittrick for inside information about Germany, since the banker had good connections in Berlin. But the 2 men also wanted to discuss another issue that was paramount concern to both of them: how to protect the assets of their German and American corporate clients during the war. Like Dulles, McKittrick was not popular with FDR and his inner circle. FDR's Treasury Secretary, Harry Morgenthau Jr., developed a loathing for McKittrick, while Morgenthau's aide, Harry Dexter White, called an American bank president doing business with the Germans while our American boys are fighting the Germans. The FDR administration moved to block the Bank of International Settlements funds in the U.S., but McKittrick hired John Foster Dulles as the legal counsel and intervened on the bank's behalf. Morgenthau was outraged when McKittrick made a business trip to the U.S. in the winter of 1942 and received a warm welcome on Wall Street. Dozens of powerful financiers and industrialists, including the executives of General Motors and Standard Oil, who had profited handsomely off of doing business with the Nazis, had a banquet in his honor at New York's University Club in December of that year, 1942. Morgenthau tried to prevent McKittrick from returning to the Bank of International Settlements headquarters in Switzerland on the grounds that the bank was clearly aiding the Nazi war effort. Alan Dulles came to McKittrick's rescue, pulling strings on the banker's behalf, and in April 1943, he boarded his transatlantic flight back to Europe. Dulles and McKittrick continued to work closely together for the rest of the war. The 2 men collaborated against Project Safe Haven that sought to track down and confiscate Nazi assets that were stashed in neutral countries. By hiding their ill-gotten wealth, members of the German elite planned to bide their time after the war and then try to regain power. Morgenthau's Treasury Department team then spearheaded Project Safe Haven and tried to reach out to OSS and the Bank of International Settlement for assistance. But Dulles and McKittrick were more inclined to protect their clients' interest. Like many in the upper echelons of U.S. finance and national security, Dulles believed that the good number of powerful German figures should be returned to power to ensure that Germany would be strong in order to continue the fight, only this time against our ally, the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, he would be more intent on using Nazi loot to finance covert anti-Soviet operations than on returning it to the families of the victims. And of course, we know what he used them for. He used them in part for Operation Gladio. Dulles realized that none of his arguments against Project Safe Haven would be well received by Morgenthau. So he resorted to time-honored methods of bureaucratic stalling and sabotage to sink the operation. Explaining in December 1944 memo to his OSS superiors that his burn office lacked adequate personnel to effectively do the job. McKittrick demonstrated equal disdain for the project, and his lack of cooperation proved very damaging to the operation, since the Bank of International Settlements was the conduit for the Nazi gold. The Treasury Department kept sending sleuth hounds over to Switzerland. The only thing they were interested in was where was Hitler putting his money, where Hermann Göring was putting his money, and where Heinrich Himmler had all of his money. While Allen Dulles was using his OSS post in Switzerland to protect the interest of Sullivan and Cromwell's German clients, his brother John Foster was doing the same in New York. By playing an intricate corporate shell game, John Foster was able to hide the U.S. assets of major German cartels like IG Farben and Merck, the chemical and pharmaceutical giants, and protect their subsidiaries from being confiscated by the federal government as alien property. Some of Foster's legal maneuvers allowed the Nazi regime to create bottlenecks in the production of war materials, such as diesel fuel injection motors that the U.S. military desperately needed for trucks, submarines, and airplanes. By the end of the war, many of Foster's clients were under investigation by the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, and John Foster himself was under scrutiny for collaborating with the enemy. But John Foster's brother was guarding his back. From his position in Europe, Allen was well placed to destroy incriminating evidence and to block any investigation that threatened the two brothers and their law firm, as well as their clients. Shredding of captured Nazi records was the favorite tactic of Dulles and his associates, who stayed behind to help run the occupation of post-war Germany. If their powerful enemy in the White House survived the war, the Dulles brothers would likely have faced serious criminal charges for wartime activity. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, who was a young attorney, served with Allen in the OSS, later declared that both Dulles brothers were guilty of treason. But with FDR gone, in April of 1945, there was not enough political will to challenge these established pillars of the American establishment. Foster was acutely aware of the knowledge of power, and he would use his control of the country's rapidly expanding post-war intelligence apparatus to carefully manage the flow of information. FDR announced the Allied doctrine of unconditional surrender. The Alliance's third major leader, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, was unable to attend the conference in Casablanca with Winston Churchill and FDR because he was still contending with the horrific Nazi siege of Stalingrad. The Red Army would finally prevail at the Battle of Stalingrad with an epic victory shifting the momentum against the Third Reich. But the costs were monumental. The Soviet Union had lost over 1 million soldiers during just that one battle, more than the U.S. would lose the entire war. The Casablanca Conference was held in January 1943 without the Russian leader, and by concluding that it was too soon to open a second major front in France, which totally pissed Stalin off because he felt like they were delaying as more Russians were killed, which is in fact what they were doing. Roosevelt's unconditional surrender declaration took Churchill by surprise. It was FDR's way of assuring Stalin that the Americans and British would not sell out the Soviet Union by cutting a separate deal with the Nazi leaders. The Casablanca Conference was a turning point in the war, sealing the fate of Hitler and his inner circle. Roosevelt, by taking an uncompromising stand against the Nazi Germany's, had made clear that they would not allow Hitler's regime to divide into an anti-fascist alliance or to escape justice. Roosevelt also said, "We mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations, but we do mean to impose punishment and retribution on the leaders." Dulles considered the unconditional surrender declaration a disaster and was quick to let his Nazi contacts know what he thought about it. Shortly after the Casablanca Conference, Dulles sat down with SS leader Heinrich Himmler. Dulles received him, who was nicknamed the Nazi Prince, at his home in Bern. The Casablanca Declaration had clearly unnerved Himmler's circle by making it clear there'd be no escape. But Dulles took pains to put his guest's mind at ease. Dulles assured him it was merely a piece of paper to be scrapped without further ado if Germany sued for peace. Thus began Allen Dulles's reign of treason as America's top spy. Maximilian Egon von Hohenlohe, the Nazi prince, was a creature of Europe's war-ravaged land aristocracy. Prince Max and his wife had once presided over an empire of properties that stretched from Bohemia to Mexico. But 2 world wars and global economic collapse had stripped them of their holdings and reduced him to playing the role of a Nazi courier. The prince had first met Allen Dulles in Vienna in 1916, when they were both young men trying to make a name for themselves. During the 30s, after he fell into the less refined company of the SS thugs who had taken over Germany, Hohenlohe popped up as an occasional guest of Allen and Clover in New York. He was just one more member of the titled set that saw advantages of Hitler's rise and was quite willing to overlook the unpleasant side. With what the prince explained away as the rank-and-file Nazi party excesses that would later be sorted out. His family was filled with ardent Nazi admirers. Perhaps the most bizarre was Stephanie von Hohenlohe, who became Hitler's princess. She was a Jew by birth. Stephanie found social position by marrying a prince. In the years before the war, she became one of Hitler's most tireless promoters, helping to bring British press magnate Lord Rothermere into the Nazi fold. Stephanie took Hitler's handsome, square-jawed Fritz Wiedemann as a lover and laid big plans for their rise to the top of the Nazi hierarchy. Jealous of her favored position with Hitler, SS rivals plotted against her, spreading stories about her Jewish origins. Her aunt died in a concentration camp, and Stephanie was forced to flee Germany. But Prince Max suffered no fall from grace. He roamed Europe, filling out British and American diplomats on possible deals with Hitler. The British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden warned against even speaking with the prince. American diplomats in Madrid, who were also approached by him, dismissed him as a liar and unscrupulous. Dulles brushed aside all of those concerns because they would make a great qualities in his spy network. And he met with them routinely. He felt perfectly at ease in the company of people like that. Before the war, Dulles had been an occasional guest of Lord and Lady Astor at Clivenden, the posh couple's country home on the Thames. That became a notorious weekend retreat for pro-Nazi aristocracy. There is no getting around this unwelcome fact. Hitler was much more fashionable in the social settings that men like Dulles frequented in England as well as the US. Royal Tyler, the go-between who set up the Bern reunion between Dulles and the prince, was cut of similar cloth. Born in Boston, Tyler traipsed around Europe for most of his life, collecting art, marrying a Florentine contessa, and playing the market. He was multilingual, and his wife led a richly cultured life, with Tyler haunting antique shops and private collections. Traveling with Tyler, noted London OSS chief David Bruce, is like taking a witty human Baedeker as a courier. The Contessa, who was equally sophisticated, moved in art and literary circles. Tyler was another one of those refined men who glided seamlessly across the borders and didn't think twice about doing business with Nazis. During the war, he moved to Geneva to dabble in banking for the Bank of International Settlements. Tyler's anti-Semitism made him a colleague with the Reich. He was also well connected in the enemy camp. Tyler was among the first people whom Dulles sought out when he got to Switzerland. Now, Dulles and the prince and their mutual friend, Royal Tyler, were gathered around the OSS man's fireplace. Dulles broke the ice by recalling old times with Prince Max in Vienna and New York. They quickly got down to business, trying to determine whether a realpolitik deal could be struck between Germany and the US that would take Hitler out of the equation but leave the Reich in place. They had much common ground. Dulles and the prince clearly saw the Soviet Union as an enemy and needed a strong Germany in order to fight them. They called them the Slavic menace. The two old friends who agreed that there was probably no room for the Jewish people in post-war Europe, and certainly they should not return to positions of power. Dulles offered that there were some in America who felt the Jews should be resettled in Africa, an old dream of Hitler's. And Hitler had once fantasized about moving them to Madagascar. The two men were too worldly to engage in emotional discussion about the Holocaust. Dulles put the prince at ease by telling him that he was fed up with hearing about all of the outdated politicians, immigrants, and prejudiced Jews. He firmly believed, quote, a peace had to be made in Europe in which all of the parties would be interested. We cannot allow it to be a peace based on the policy of winners and losers, unquote. You know, nothing like an actual war, just controlled chaos. Instead of Roosevelt's unconditional surrender, in which the Nazi leadership would be held account, Dulles was not in favor of that. The pact that Dulles envisioned not only dismissed the genocide against the Jews as an irrelevant issue, it also rejected the president's firmly stated policy against secret deals with the enemy. While boldly undermining the president, Dulles had the nerve to assure the prince that he had FDR's complete support. The fireplace meeting, in fact, was a double betrayal. Dulles's of President Roosevelt and the Nazi princes of Adolf Hitler. Hovering was around was Heinrich Himmler. He was the Reich's second most powerful man, and he dared to think that he could become number one. Himmler looked less of an icon of a master race than he actually looked like a bank clerk. He had been a chicken farmer and fertilizer salesman that basically had worked his way up the Nazi regime. It was Himmler whom Hitler had entrusted with the final solution, their plan to wipe out the Jewish people from the face of the earth. It was Himmler who had the nerve to justify this plan, standing before the SS generals in October 1943 and assuring them that they had the moral right to destroy people. Himmler was Nazi leader most gifted at solving the problems of conscience that sometimes nagged the executioners. With his winged words and his diligent administrator, Adolf Eichmann, put it, Himmler transformed his men's gruesome work into a grand and secret mission that they were capable of fulfilling. In the end, it was Himmler who, despite his long enchantment with the Hitler cult, had the brass to consider replacing him when he realized that it wasn't going to be viable for him to be around at the end of the war. Prince Max was only one of the emissaries of Himmler dispatched across Europe to seek a separate peace deal with the US and England. Himmler even recruited fashion designer Coco Chanel, bringing her to Berlin to discuss the strategy. Himmler knew he was playing a very dangerous game, letting Hitler know just enough about his peace fillers, but not enough to arouse suspicion. Dulles, too, understood that he was playing with fire going against FDR. After receiving a warning from Washington about fraternizing with the prince, Dulles sent back a cable saying that he realized the prince was a tough customer and extreme caution required, but found him useful. Dulles did not find it necessary to inform his superiors just how deeply involved he was. Dulles and Tyler met with the prince on several occasions over the next few weeks. And even as late as November 1943, Dulles continued to forward to Washington Prince Max reports on Himmler's frame of mind. Dulles regarded the prince as a serious enough collaborator to give him his own secret OSS number, 515. In the end, Dulles' machinations with the prince went nowhere. President Roosevelt was very much in control of the U.S. government, and his uncompromising position on Nazi capitulation was still firmly in place. When OSS Chief Wild Bill Donovan informed the president about Himmler's peace initiatives, FDR made it clear that he was adamantly opposed to it. Despite Heinrich Himmler's elusive quest to cut a deal with his allies, he never lost faith in Dulles. On May 10, 1945, just days after the war ended, Himmler set out from northern Germany with an entourage of faithful US SS officers toward Switzerland and the protection of his American agent. He was disguised in a blue raincoat with a patch over his eye. But Himmler never made it to the rendezvous. The SS chief was captured by British soldiers as they prepared to cross a river. While in custody, Himmler cheated the hangman by biting a glass of cyanide. Even if Himmler had made it to Switzerland, he would not have found sanctuary. He was too prominent a face of the Nazi regime to even be salvaged by Dulles. But that didn't keep Dulles from rescuing a whole bunch of others, which we will go into in the next chapter. Did Bridget ever join us? Nope. Okay. Let me bring Stellar.
Sorry, she didn't show up.
That's okay. She's taking care of her husband. That's a good thing to have to do. All right. So that's where we leave it. Go ahead, SR.
I want to thank everybody for attending here on Spaces as well as Rumble. And I know we got some interesting stuff coming up with CanCon later on, but keeping with the subject, Big Monitor made a statement on Rumble that the Dulles brothers had all kinds of blackmail material on people. And something just flipped in my head that said, now wait a minute. Wouldn't you think the Dulles people had all kinds of blackmail material on the Dulles brothers, specifically the international syndicate?
So go ahead.
I'm trying to tug on that thread for a little bit here and trying to figure out who in the world that might have been.
FBI director. He had a very, very thick file on Alan Dulles. He had a file on both of the Dulles brothers, but the file on Alan Dulles was much thicker than John Foster. But J. Edgar Hoover tracked Alan Dulles everywhere. He knew about his affairs overseas. Alan Dulles wrote his wife about him. The problem with somebody like Alan Dulles is he felt himself so far above the fray that he didn't keep secrets from his the close associates. He told his wife every time he had an affair. We're going to find out in one of these stories that the wife actually hung around with his mistress. So it was very hard to have any blackmail material on Alan Dulles because he made sure that the only people that mattered already knew, and they didn't have a problem with knowing it. So, I mean, all of them knew, but they had blackmail material on each other. So when John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles was making all of these deals with all of the other oligarchs in the U.S. to continue business with the Nazis, they're all in on it. I mean, we find out later on that Eisenhower was certainly in on it. They put Eisenhower as the NATO commander. Then they get behind him and promote him for president. And, and he goes and overthrows all of the countries that they have interest in. It's just one big hive. And so it's hard for somebody that if you're inside that, that's the people that know all of the dirt. Most of the people outside this envelope don't know about all of it as it's going on. We only find out 30 or 40 years later when some of these cables get declassified what they were actually up to. All along, go ahead.
Yeah, Colonel, your point about Alan Dulles being sensing that he did not need to maintain a level of secrecy, I think is kind of important and illustrative of, just the kind of relationships that this, extreme upper class set, as it were, had. I mean, Alan Dulles was engaged in, had sexual relationships with Henry Luce's extremely dynamic wife.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a kind of slanderous sexual sense, but more, she was just extremely dynamic in myriad ways. She was about Claire Luce.
Yes.
Just unbelievable. I'm sure you've discussed her on many times. But and also he was, relating, he had sexual relations with the Bancroft, one of the Bancroft girls in the Wall Street Journal's ownership family, the Bancroft family that owned the Wall Street Journal before the Murdochs bought it. So, those kind of shenanigans, as it were, are kind of suggest that, a kind of comfort that is based on, really elite connections. And
yes.
Perhaps that might, when you're that connected to media, you own the secret machine, as it were, that is based on
yes.
really elite connections.
I think you're speaking of Mary Bancroft.
Yes, Mary Bancroft.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, she makes an appearance in the book too. Yeah, it's very interesting. But obviously, the dynamic, and they go into it a little bit, between Alan Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover, was one of the most intriguing ones for me, just because of the dirt that both of those people had access to. Stellar, go ahead.
I'm just amazed that this man, I mean, just this man is just like total pure evil. And wow. And geez, just, I mean, it's just kind of mind blowing and stuff like that. And the fact that he was able to get away with it, and then, you know, just dirty and holy cow. But does that make sense? I mean,
Yes.
it was like in our faces, crazy.
Yes. And the people, you know, especially even the next 3 or 4 levels down that were in Washington, D.C. back in the day. If you read some of their biographies, a lot of them knew pieces of this. And people were just flabbergasted when Eisenhower named John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles as the Secretary of State and the CIA. But understanding that the only way Eisenhower got to be president. Interesting dynamic, because he was being courted by both the Democrats and the Republicans, because he had not officially been a part of either party. Once he was aligned with the Republicans, it was a foregone conclusion that these people, like John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, that had both supported the Republican Party, was going to be in high level positions, because it was largely their behind the scenes dealings that got Eisenhower the funding in order to make it to the presidency. So, you know, and I had always grown up, you know, through the military and the military brainwashing, to think about Eisenhower as this great leader. And at the end of the day, he was anything but. And it's very, very disappointing. A lot of the people that you think are military heroes turn out not to be military heroes at all, as we discovered with Lyman Lemonsker. But anyway, all right.
You only need to look at Walsh for that.
Yeah, he wasn't a leader, though. I mean, he was a nobody. I'm more of a leader than he was.
It's a wonder that this stuff is being exposed. And I mean, everything from the past, I mean, it just seems like these operations, Operation Gladio, the OSS, a lot of stuff that was I can see things being undone from a lot of the things that they had set up many, many, many decades earlier.
Well, it is kind of funny, not in a joyous, funny way, but in an ironic kind of way, that all of these books that we've been through, you guys know when we did the corporate coup, and learned all about the shenanigans going on with the CIA in Venezuela way back in the day. And you knew who was behind the cartel of the sun. And then, oh my gosh, look, today they just dropped that as, yeah, no, that doesn't really exist. But you guys all knew that. You guys all knew who was behind it. The CIA is the one that created it. The generals that were running it were on their payroll. And, you know, there's no way that that was going to be talked about in a courtroom, because you can't talk about the cartel of the sun without mentioning the origins of it and the CIA's support, because both of those guys were on their payroll. So it came as nobody that follows us surprised that announcement got made. And I just have found it so comforting, I guess is the right word, that we're on the right track, because all of the information that we've shared, you can just see everything in a completely different light and know what's really going on. And that's been, and I told you 3 years ago when we started all of this, that I felt divinely inspired to do this. And that many of the books that we've done, has, it wasn't like I planned to do that book. There just was a, I don't know, something would happen and I would like, oh, that's the next book that we have to do. So it's just been a very interesting journey for all of us. But anyway, it sets us up nicely to be able to participate in what's going on right now with a knowledge that is unlike what most Americans have. So I'm very thankful for that. All right. I'm going to get off.
Well, as their stuff goes around and around to go down the toilet, you know, like how the whirly things go down. Everything is like now coming together so much more clear. And thank you, because like I said, had no idea. So another quick question. Since,
Sure.
You know, back in the day, like when Hitler, you know, like you said, the banking internet, they just kind of captured France and all that other stuff as far as their banking and stuff. Is that what happened with us? Because I saw that Switzerland put freezes on Duro stuff.
So you cut out, I couldn't hear what your actual question was.
So you know how you said back in the day, you know, like how the banking of international settlements, like when Hitler took over France, they just took over their banking account and France didn't exist anymore. It just kind of got merged into Germany.
Yeah.
So now that what has happened with Venezuela?
So they were,
yes.
yeah, no. Switzerland is saying that the Swiss banks, Switzerland does not speak on behalf of the Bank of International Settlements. They are a sovereign entity. They are like the Vatican. They do not report to anybody. They have their own police. They have their own fire department. They have their own everything. Their own security. They reside in Switzerland, but they have their own press. They have their own everything. So the announcement was Switzerland was going to freeze any Switzerland accounts, but that does not apply to the Bank of International Settlements. I've not seen any statement out of the Bank of International Settlements. Does that?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I was just wondering because I saw that I'm like, huh.
Yeah.
You know, so I thought I'd ask. I do know that he does have the keys for the 500,000 Bitcoin, so that's a good thing.
SR, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. I did want to mention one thing, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, is today is January 6th.
Yep.
We know what this is all about.
Yep.
If you haven't seen the Colonel's Corner on Rumble with her two guests that actually experience a tyrannical government, I highly recommend you watch it. And I thank you and those two individuals very much for that, Colonel.
Yeah, I'm going to get the individuals are Olivia Pollock, my neighbor, and Robert Morris, aka the Lego Man. The interview was amazing. It's my favorite interview I've ever done. And they both have just crazy stories of what happened to them as a result of January 6th. I am getting Lego Man on CanCon and Alpha's Sit Rep show. I highly recommended that they interview him. So hopefully that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. And also, I will keep tabs on him. I told him to make sure that he lets me know when he's putting out a production, a video that we definitely need to support. He is going to be opening a production company and doing family themed movies and short films. So we definitely want to support him as he goes forward on that journey. But thanks, SR, for mentioning that. And yeah, happy Patriots Day.
The other thing I'd like to add to that, if anybody's paying attention to MS Now, which I do because I want to know what these idiots are doing, they're still saying this was an insurrection and we did this and we have videos of this and we have videos of that and the whole 9 yards. They refuse to believe that all of this was staged and what was done afterwards is wrong.
Yep.
Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. All right. So I will be on the book club with CanCon and Ash at 6 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and jump off of here. That's over on Rumble on Badlands Media called the book club. If you guys want to join me, we are going to be talking about the crazy book called Stolen Elections that everybody is just going hog wild about. And I tell you, it's like putting an ice pick in my brain to read that book. It is one of the most poorly sourced books I've ever come across. I mean, I wouldn't have bought that if it was in one of those free. I wouldn't have taken it if it was in one of those free libraries. It is very, very painful because every single source that they do use, which is very few, it's some crazy Soros funded, USAID funded garbage shit. And then you have people like Laura Logan, who I love, hyping it. Rasmussen has like just went ape shit crazy over it. And I'm like, what kind of research do you guys do? I mean, you can't read that book and not go, what the hell? It's the craziest thing. So after we get done with the book, I'll put together, like an article or something that just points out all of the craziness to it. Because anyway, I don't want to get ahead of their book club, but it's crazy. But we are going to go back over the first 4 chapters tonight in order to kind of get me caught up and them caught up with my takeaways on what they've already covered. And then next week, we'll start off on chapter 5 of the book. But it's going to be a hoot. I can tell you that. If you guys want to see the way I do research and what I look at, you're going to see it because it's crazy. All right. You guys take care. I'm going to grab some dinner before my next show. Take care of you.
Be sure to post that link too. Thank you.
Sure, I will. Thank you. All right. Thank you, guys.